Gibson here. So we're going to continue our lessons here on how do we develop a statistical process to test a hypothesis. An important step in that process is collecting data. So what we're going to look at today is identifying different types of sampling methods in statistical studies. Recognize that we can introduce bias in sampling. So bias means that we're favoring one outcome over another or trying to influence. So in general, we want to have unbiased methods when we collect data. And then analyze methods of collecting data and recognize that when we do a survey, we can introduce bias by just how we phrase the questions. All right. So the steps of a typical statistical study are shown below, right? It starts out with identifying the variable of interest in the population of study. Maybe we want to know the favorite fruit, right, of students at school. So the variable would be which fruit, and the population would be the students at school. So then we choose a sample that is representative of the population. We may not be able to ask every student, but how are we going to choose our sample? And then we'll go ahead and collect data using that process that we have come up with to sample the population. Then we're going to organize and describe the data using a statistic. Remember, a statistic is the characteristic of the sample. And then we're going to interpret the data and make inferences. Now that's probably a new term, statistical term. It says make inferences and draw conclusions about the population. Okay, so that's kind of analyzing our data. So this is the process that we're studying, right? What we've did in the previous lesson, 6.4, was to identify the variable of interest and the population of study, right? What's the difference between a population and a sample, a parameter and a statistic? How do we state our hypothesis? This lesson is going to look at these two steps of the process. How do we choose a sample that's fair, that fairly represents the population? And then what are the different ways that we can collect the data? So the next two lessons will take us into these last two steps here. All right, so let's look at some ways that we can sample our population. So sampling methods in statistical studies. So what we're doing, right, is creating or selecting a subset out of the entire population, but there are different ways to do that. The best way is what we call a random sample, where each member of the population has an equal chance of being selected. Okay, that will give us the greatest probability that our sample is going to reflect the greater population. We could have what we call a systematic sample. So this is made perhaps a rule that is used to select members of the population. So for example, we could just take every third person, right, that walks by and ask them to fill out a survey. A stratified sample is where we take the population and divide it into smaller groups that share a similar characteristic. And then a sample is then randomly selected for each group. So let's say we wanted to compare the opinions of men versus women around a particular issue, right? So we would create two populations, one of men, one of women, and then randomly sample each of them, right, to get their opinions. A cluster sample, a population is divided into small cluster groups, and then all the members of one or more of those clusters are selected. So for example, you might want to study how students feel about the daily announcements, right? And you could, we're already clustered in classes, so you could say, okay, I'm going to pick one out of all three classes and then ask all the students in that class what they think about the daily announcements. And then a couple other examples, self-selected samples. So this is where members of a population can volunteer to be in the sample. This is what often happens with a survey, right? The school may want to get input from parents. So they'll put a survey out to all parents using their emails, but the subset are really just those that choose to volunteer and fill out the survey. And then the last one is a convenience sample. And this includes only members of the population that are easy to reach. And those are the ones that we select and gather data from. So let's look at some examples here. I've got 5, A through E, of different ways that we've sampled our population, and see if you can identify, right, which of those 6 different types of samples it's describing. So random, self-selected, systematic, stratified, cluster, or convenience. And you may have to look back at your notes or even skip back in this video to remember what the attributes are for those different sampling methods. So the first one, it says you list all of the students alphabetically and choose every 6th student. Okay. So that would be our systematic, right? We've got a rule that we use, every 6 students. We're going to take that one and include them in our subset or sample. Part B, you mail questionnaires out and use only the ones that are returned. Okay, so that is an example of self-selection. Very much the case when you send out a survey to a large group of people and you rely on those that volunteer to respond. Part C, you ask all the students in your math class. Well, if we were doing a survey, right, in our class, we were physically in class, that would be the easiest thing to do, right? Because you've got them all right there. You can pass out the survey. Every one of them can turn it in. That would be a sample of convenience. Part D, you randomly select 2 students from each group. Okay, so think about the process where you divide things into groups and then you randomly select within that group, right? That's what we call a stratified sample. And the last one, you pick names out of a box that contains all student names. And that would be a random sample. And as we've said at the beginning, a random, truly random sample is always the best way to get a fair representation of your population. All right, how do we recognize that we have bias in sampling? So a bias is an error that results in a misrepresentation of the population. An unbiased sample is a representation sample of the population that you want information about, right? We want to, unbiased means it's going to do the best job of representing the population. A sample that overrepresents or underrepresents part of the population is a biased sample. Okay, so if we wanted to get opinion between men and women, right, of a certain issue, but 80% of who we surveyed were women, then that would overrepresent, right, the women in the group. So a random sample is the best thing we can do to reduce the possibility of a biased sample. So let's look at some examples and see why the bias or the sample is biased. So a news organization asks its viewers to participate in an online poll about bullying. So we would say the viewers can choose to participate. So it's self-selected, right? So that's the type of sample that we're doing. And the sample is biased because people who go online and respond to the poll most likely have a strong opinion about bullying, right? If you didn't care that much about it or didn't have a strong opinion, you probably wouldn't bother to voluntarily answer the survey. Okay. Let's look at another case. A computer science teacher wants to know how students at a school most often access the internet. The teacher asks students in one of the computer science classes. Okay, so he's asking a class that he teaches. So that is what we call a convenience sample. It's easy. I have my students right here in the room. I can ask them this question. Now the sample is biased because other students in the school did not have an opportunity to be chosen, right? And perhaps students that are taking a computer science class have different ways of accessing the internet than what maybe a student who's not that interested in computer science might have. All right, so let's look at another example here. How do we select an unbiased sample? So you're a member of your school book's yearbook committee. You want to poll members of the senior class to find out what the theme of the yearbook should be. There are 246 students in the senior class. So let's kind of go through what would be a good method for selecting a random sample of 50 seniors to poll or survey. And by random, we mean each senior has an equal chance of being polled. So here's one way we could do it, right? We could write the name of each senior on an index card. So we get 246 index cards. Now, I'm not going to put all 246 up here on the screen, but let's pretend this stack of index cards, right, are for all the seniors in the senior class, 246 of them, okay? The next step might be to either take all those cards and put them in a big bin or box, but basically shuffle them up, right? So we're going to mix up all these cards. And once they're mixed, then we would draw out one card at a time until we have 50 seniors, right? And that would be a good random sample, right, of the 246 total seniors in the class. Okay, so there are ways, very simple ways, just using literally paper and pencil, that we can create a random sample. If we have some computer tools, right, we could do it even differently. We could assign a number, right, to each student, and then have a computer randomly generate numbers within that range, and in essence let the computer, right, pick the cards. All right, last concept here, methods of collecting data. We've got four main ways in which we can do this. The first is an experiment, and an experiment imposes a treatment on individuals in order to collect data on their response to the treatment, right? So this is a example of what we're doing right now with the COVID virus, right? And the vaccines. We conducted an experiment. We had one group of people that got the vaccine. They got the treatment. We have another group of people that did not get a vaccine, or the vaccine that they got was what we call placebo, right? It didn't really have any vaccine in it. And you didn't know which case was which. That would be an experiment. But sometimes we can't always isolate the population or actually apply a treatment to them. So often we can only do what we call an observational study. So this is where we observe individuals and measure variables without controlling the individual or their environment. So this is where we would use this type of study where it's difficult to control or isolate the variable being studied, or it may be dangerous, right, to force someone to do take some treatment or a different treatment. A third type is a survey. This is kind of what we think of most commonly, where we ask questions or investigate one or more characteristics of a population. In a survey, every member of the sample is asked one or more questions, and we ask them the same questions. The last method is what we call a simulation. A simulation uses a model to reproduce the conditions of a situation or process so that the simulated outcomes closely match the real world outcomes. And again, this past year with the COVID virus, right, we would never intentionally release the virus into the world and see how it spreads. But there was a lot of work done to create computer models that match what we see in the real world, and then use those models to simulate what we think might happen. Okay, so experiment, observational study, survey, and simulation. Right, so I'm going to give you some examples of collecting data and see if you can identify, right, which of those four methods are being used. So here's the first one. A researcher records whether people at a gas station use hand sanitizer. So which method do you think that is? Well, we're not forcing them to do a treatment, right? We don't say half of you use sanitizer and half of you don't use hand sanitizer. This is simply an observational study, right? We're going to kind of sit back without being noticed too much and just see, okay, only 1 out of 4 people used hand sanitizer at the gas station. Let's look at another example. A landscaper fertilizes 20 lawns with a regular fertilizer mix and 20 lawns with a new organic fertilizer. The landscaper then compares the lawns after 10 weeks, right? Which one is greener? Which one is healthier? Which one is longer? and determines which fertilizer is better. What type of data collection would this be? Well, this would be an experiment, right? Because we're applying a treatment, in this case, different fertilizers to individual lawns. So we would call this an experimental study. All right, let's look at a couple more. Members of a student council at school ask every 8th student who enters the cafeteria whether they like the produce being served. Okay, how do they like the fruits and vegetables? So this would simply be a survey, right? We've identified a sample, 1 out of every 8 students, and we're asking them a question. So we would collect our data using a survey. And then how about this last one? A researcher uses a computer program to help determine how fast the COVID-19 virus might spread within California. Well, this would be a simulation, right? We would never intentionally introduce a virus to study its spread. So we use simulations, or when it's actually spreading, not by design, but we would then collect data and help to confirm, right, the models that we're using to do the simulation. All right, last topic here, identify and correct bias in survey questioning. So biased questions when we're constructing a survey are those that are flawed in a way that lead to inaccurate results. It really has to do with often just how we word the survey question. We don't want to word them in a way that leads to a particular opinion or result. So let's look at some examples here, and I think you'll get a feel for what a biased question might look like. So we want to avoid questions like that may encourage a particular response. So we could ask a question like this: do you agree that climate change, which is already causing great damage to the world, should be a high priority? Well, as soon as we say, do you agree, then it kind of maybe encourages, or the person maybe feel obligated to, yeah, I better agree with this person asking me this question. I don't want to be considered someone who just disagrees with everything. And then we make a statement which is already causing great damage to the world, right? That certainly leads the person to respond that yes, it should be a high priority. Or maybe a question that's too sensitive to answer truthfully, right? How often do you use illegal drugs? Now, if you ask a person this face to face, right, you probably are not going to get a very truthful answer. If you had a way for them to do this anonymously, right, so you don't know who answered the question, then perhaps we would get a less biased result. How about questions that don't provide enough information to give an accurate opinion, such as, how do you feel about healthcare? Well, that is a very broad question, right? There are lots of particular issues about healthcare, the accessibility of it, the quality of it, the cost of it, all those things. And this question doesn't go into enough detail. And then the last one, you can ask a question that addresses more than one issue, and it then becomes difficult to separate out the data. So you could say, do you brush your teeth at least twice a day? Oh, and do you floss every day? Right? So those are 2 separate questions in a single, two separate issues that are in a single question. Okay, so these are examples of biased questions. We want to be very careful when we choose our words so that we don't lead them to a particular result or opinion. All right, that's it for this lesson. So we know how to identify types of sampling methods in statistical studies. The best sampling method is always a truly random sample. We understand how we can introduce bias in sampling. We looked at different ways of collecting data, right? We can do a experimental, we can do observational, we can do a survey, or we can do a simulation. And then for surveys in particular, we want to be very careful that we don't word them in such a way that introduce bias. All right, that's it for this lesson. Take a look at the assignment.